I'm here to talk about the remedy and in some sense help provide a sense of closure and wrap-up to what has been a wonderful day, and I suppose isn't over when I'm done, since there'll be some lively discussion, I hope, afterwards. So I'll ultimately, on remedy, be coming out surprisingly on the side of Bob and perhaps Rick, who just departed, but no connection to the Parade of Horribles there, as far as what the remedy should be. But to actually talk about remedy, I'd like to try to put into a package exactly what really this case is all about. Around this time of day, there's now sort of a generic fog drifting through the room as to exactly what the Microsoft case is about. And perhaps I will be pumping more smoke into it, but I will do my best to clear it instead. In the discussion period prior, I put forth the idea that there is something different about a networked environment, caused by the fact that people are constantly exchanging files and programs on their computers, even if they're not literally networked together. Anybody who uses the word processor often uses other people's files with their word processor, and if they get a file in an incompatible format, they might as well not have a word processor. So in some sense, there are networks out there, and of course, even in a deeper sense, it is truly becoming a networked world, one in which every computer on every desktop is permanently hooked up to the internet, and most of the value you extract from the computer comes from the network, not actually from the processor that's inside or the screensaver that sends a toaster flying across your screen. So if that is my starting point, my claim then is motion in a networked environment, going from one predominant operating system, one predominant regime of technology that might be proprietary to one company, which is loving it for the duration of time that their technology is central and is proprietary, eventually will be replaced by another one. We don't stay in slow motion here. We know that the internet happens quickly, and a lot of the examples brought up are of falls of Roman empires and new Roman empires that come up to displace the old, no matter how powerful they seemed. But my claim is, as you make the transition from the old to the new, is there any consistent way in which the person that had the lock, had the winning ticket in the last generation of operating systems, might be said to have some advantage so strong that it may not guarantee a win. You could probably screw up sufficiently that even with your advantage you might blow it, but enough of an advantage that it actually does create a consistent competitive problem. And that's why it's not just a question of getting in early. I said before, if you get in early, if you're first to market, there are all sorts of benefits that amount to an ability to recoup later once you've established market dominance and through network effects made it difficult for others to take your place, even if presumably they would be better, all else being equal. In addition to getting in early, it helps to have a really big war chest, a lot of money behind you so that you can tough it out in a market through the vicissitudes, and also a little extra help. And how do we define extra help? Well, to me, it might be useful to think of a category of extra help grounded in, such as it may be, the monopoly in operating systems that some people perceive that Microsoft has. Now, I tried to tell in very brief fashion the story of Java as a way of explaining why I thought who would win the browser war. And by the way, I credit that the browser war is over. It's just a question of mopping up the battlefield. Netscape may not know it yet, but it's time for them to go home. But who wins that war actually has a dig into the next generation of the operating system. And the reason why is exactly the kinds of things that Bob was talking about. He talked about the network computer that merely sits there, and you don't really care what its operating system is because it's downloading most of the software it needs from the internet at the time and then just running it on the screen. Indeed, this is somewhat the vision of Java integrated with the browser. But again, my point is, if the predominant browser is Internet Explorer, that gives Microsoft license to define what the Java inside or other features will be, and now the new platform is run by the same company as the old. Now, there's no reason Microsoft shouldn't have a shot at competing for what may be the new environment that displaces the old one. But then again, you get to the question of, well, what is the extra help it may be able to rely upon thanks to its monopoly? Now, a lot of the case, what you just heard about in terms of browser integration, is exactly the government's claim about extra help. Now, you may ask, is it really such a big deal when you first turn on your new Dell, you just unpacked it, you turn it on, and there's IE, Internet Explorer, front and center? Does that really mean you're going to end up using IE 6 months from now instead of Netscape, which if you're willing to wait several hours, you can download and install and have running parallel with the other browser? To me, actually, the answer is quite credibly yes. That really could be. And indeed, as much as from one side you hear the argument, well, you can uninstall it so quickly it doesn't matter, or you can easily put in a competing browser, so what's the big deal? Well, that does cut both ways. Because after all, it was Microsoft that prevailed on companies like Dell to say, by the way, Dell, if you want your computer to leave the factory with Windows on it, going out to consumers, so when they turn it on, they see Windows, and a computer without Windows, from Dell's point of view, is pretty much a worthless computer in the market they're in, you have to have IE on it, compulsory licensing. Now, why is compulsory licensing so critical or so important to Microsoft that it's worth a big fight to retain it? Well, it's the same reason that, yeah, I guess the power of the default is a lot of power. And a lot of people don't know from Internet Explorer versus Netscape, and indeed, the critical differences between them aren't differences that a consumer may even be in a position to care about. Why do they care whether it runs one flavor of Java or another? You know, as long as it browses, they're happy. Even though taken across all consumers, once one browser becomes dominant, that actually has, again, the significant ramifications as to whose Java wins, and therefore whose operating system is the next generation winner. So as soon as these contracts to the people like Dell say you must include Internet Explorer, it certainly indicates some belief on Microsoft's part of the value of having that icon on the desktop. Now, another way they could have gone about including Internet Explorer would simply be to try to persuade, to say, by the way, Dell, we've just sealed this deal to give you Windows. Don't you want Internet Explorer too? Let's put you in touch with our Internet Explorer sales force, and they can convince you how nice it would be, and believe it or not, the price is zero, so why not take it? Indeed, that's what Netscape is stuck trying to do in order to get people like Dell to bundle the thing on. That may be some idea of fair competition, but Microsoft has the ace in the hole, and the ace in the hole is you must take Internet Explorer. You actually must take the CD, install it on the computer, and ship it out to the consumer that way. That was what at least the Windows 95 litigation was about. Can Microsoft require the OEM, somebody like Dell, to actually put IE, Internet Explorer, onto that desktop, even if they didn't want it? And to claim that, well, everybody wants it anyway, so the contract is meaningless, well, all right then, why don't you get rid of the contract? Now, another example of contract use of the monopoly power, America Online. America Online's lifeblood, and they've been touted as a competitor, say, to the Microsoft network, yet another area in which Microsoft has chosen to compete. America Online's lifeblood is new subscribers. They've got to keep new people coming in the door so that their network can grow and so that they can start financing all of the giveaways they're doing to get the original people in the door. In order to do that, again, there's thought to be some real power of the default. After all, when you first turn on your computer and you click on something that says, I'd like to get on the internet, you're presented with choices. Well, who do you want to use? Do you want to use AOL or somebody else? You make that decision, you get your email account, and now it actually is somewhat of a big deal to switch away from your existing internet provider. By the way, my new email address is, please forget the old one. Everybody hates you for spamming them, et cetera, et cetera. So AOL needed that place on the desktop as a very important strategic component of signing up new members. So Microsoft says, okay, it's our desktop. What are you bid? And in fact, it didn't turn out to be a bidding in money. It was a bidding in, instead of actually paying us a whole lot, why don't you agree that when people run AOL, they'll be running Internet Explorer in connection with that when they surf the web? Again, yet another way to make sure Internet Explorer is going out to AOL's people and not Netscape. Again, there's no parallel deal that Netscape can offer. There's nothing they can do to say, well, why don't you take Netscape instead? It's a deal that only Microsoft, thanks to their monopoly position, can offer, and one then that is very difficult for AOL to refuse. As a side note to this story, by the way, originally there was something called the Online Services folder in the desktop, and AOL and others needed to deal with Microsoft to secure a space in that folder. Once they had done so, a newer version of Windows had the Internet Connection Wizard. Now, they left the Online Services folder there on the desktop, but it turned out that nobody used it anymore to get on because, after all, you clicked on the Connection Wizard to choose your Internet connection. And guess what? A new round of negotiations began to say, okay, you'd like a place in the Connection Wizard, I see. What will we bid for that? And suddenly you appreciate the real power that the person who is behind the operating system, and by extension the desktop, has, the aces in the hole they own, that nobody else can possibly negotiate with. And that may well be something for concern. Now that was, again, the Windows 95 case. And again, Bob pointed out that, well, despite the fact it was on the desktop, while the OEM, Dell, was not allowed to execute that 90 seconds of effort to eliminate IE from the desktop, they were prohibited from contract from doing that, the consumer could always do it. But the lesson learned from the Windows 95 litigation and from the Court of Appeals decision that I thought was very well characterized and quite generous to Microsoft, the lesson learned was, I see, let's not deal with these pesky contracts to get the OEMs, that is the Dells of the world, to put Internet Explorer on the desktop. Let's just put it in and nail it down. And then they can pry at it all they want, but it's not coming back up. You can spend all the series of 90 seconds you want, but again, as the story we heard earlier shows, you need to be a computer scientist at Princeton to have a hope of removing Internet Explorer from the latest version of Windows, and even then, they point out just how it didn't really work and it kind of breaks Windows. And by the way, our next version of Windows will make sure that the way he pried it out is fixed. We'll get rid of that bug. This is the idea behind technological tying, and again illustrates the amazing power that is in the hands of the existing company that runs the operating system to define what the user of the computer sees and when. To define it as mere advertising, I think, isn't to do justice truly to the amount of power that it is. I leave it to you to figure out whether it's really a monopoly or not. But it's not mere advertising. It's what you see when you first turn on the computer, and it's the code, the software that's already loaded in there. Again, you have to sit there and download it, and maybe it's not compatible, blah, blah, blah. It's all one seamless package for which the average user strays away at her peril. So that, to me, is what is at stake in the case, and why, when you look at the different allegations of so-called bad behavior, it actually may be seen to matter. It's not just bad behavior that once you stop it, and remember, a lot of the arguments you hear are, we're done with that. We don't do that anymore. Those contracts, that's a thing of the past. And that may well be so. But again, once you've got in and you've used them to your advantage, and now IE has won the battle, you've got the foot in the door you need. And the rest of it can now be the natural effects of network effects to make sure that you get and secure the rest of the dominance in what will be the new set of operating systems. So with that said, let me talk about possible remedies that we've heard. So the first remedy that was put forward today was the idea of doing nothing. And that idea was, well, first was the idea of doing nothing, since after all there's no problem, but let's put that aside. The other doing nothing is, look, the suit itself helps. Just to have put them through all the hassle of a lawsuit has been really constructive for everybody. Now, I think there is some possibility of truth to that, but there are also problems. For one thing, one of the so-called values of just saying it was nice to have had the lawsuit, that was fun, is that it distracted the company. That was touted as a benefit. You know, we sort of put a drag on Microsoft's jet by forcing their productive engineers to engage in long depositions, to have their email rifled through, to cause them anxiety on the golf course, that kind of thing. I say that's a rather dubious remedy, and one that isn't necessarily properly scaled to the problem. Exactly how much drag is enough? Should you do a few vindictive depositions just to, do you think they're really powerful and it's only the slight market leaders that deserve only a preliminary injunction maybe, and then you abandon the suit? It seems a little bit difficult. The other point of doing nothing, of course, was that it emboldens others. That once, I guess you'd call this the circling vulture syndrome, where, good, the government is really giving them a kick, maybe I'll run up, and I was afraid to before, but now I'll kind of deliver a quick, swift kick to the ribs of Microsoft while they're down. I'm not sure exactly that that's a really quantifiable way to go about dealing with whatever problem there may exist, and also realize that a big part of the battle is for venture capital. If you are a new company wanting to start out in this area, the first question you are going to be asked is, so has Microsoft indicated any interest in this area? And if you start out and you do a couple of years well, then of course the next question is, has Microsoft indicated any interest in you or in doing something else in this area? And indeed, the market is such that so much working capital is in the hands of Microsoft as either a war chest or just a fund for further research and development, depending on how you look at it, that there actually are ways in which you could see the market is no longer as fluid as it used to be. That whether or not you even have a chance of developing your good idea in some ways depends on the venture capitalists' perceptions of where Microsoft is going to be. Now let me bracket that by the fact that no evidence whatsoever on this facet of things has been introduced in the case, so you can't treat it as evidence introduced in the case. Also notice that there was the problem of speed that was put forward. This stuff moves really quickly. And as you start a long litigation, and even, it seems like it's been a long time, hasn't it? It hasn't been IBM long, but it's still been long. And again, my hypothesis is the browser war is over. What it really says is, to the monopolist or the company that might be targeted, just make sure you act quickly. And if you do, yeah, you'll get some drag on a lawsuit, but by the end of it, hopefully you still will have managed to leverage your position in a good way. Also, the claim was made that the lawsuit gets you to stop the practices. In order to make the lawsuit no longer valid, to make it basically moot, just stop the practices. And indeed, many of the contracts at issue have been abandoned. But notice that the practices on the technological side, what I call the lessons learned from the Windows 95 litigation, have not been abandoned at all. Indeed, we see Internet Explorer increasingly integrated into the operating system. Rick Rule was very careful, you saw, to talk about Microsoft's browser as a solution. It's not a software product, it's a browsing solution, which is part of a platform, which is Windows, whereas maybe Netscape is a product. It's software that is a browser that runs. And indeed, in his comparison, he compared Netscape, the browser. He said, remember, there's a lot of new Netscapes getting onto desktops, and he compared it with the number of Windows 98s getting onto desktops. Those were the two comparisons, Netscape versus Windows 98. Now, that's entirely consistent with the position that Internet Explorer is nothing but a component of Windows 98. But on the other hand, it does seem like it might be a bit apples and oranges when many of the new versions of a browser coming out, even Internet Explorer, aren't coming because people are buying Windows 98. I mean, just the other day, I took my Windows 95 and went ahead and updated my IE, which I love. Again, IE, I think, is the best browser by far. I upgraded it to 5.0. And again, I don't know if that would be counted in the tally in the competition between Windows 98 and Netscape. The other point on practices that aren't stopped by the mere existence of a lawsuit is this idea of embrace and extend. Again, I credit this as a perfectly logical thing for Microsoft to do. But again, this is the big picture here. Some of the aspects of the global internet that you use today are not proprietary to anybody. Now, this may cause Bob to have a cow, the idea that there actually exists something that people are using, extracting value from, that is actually not owned by anybody. But guess what? Something called, for instance, TCP/IP, the very protocols by which I can send you an email from my Mac. I can initiate some kind of session between my Mac and your PC and his Linux box. Those are all enabled by the common platform of Internet Protocol, IP. And IP isn't owned by anybody. IP gets evolved when engineers from different companies, from universities, get together in these informal meetings at the Internet Engineering Task Force, which, by the way, is not incorporated, has no legal personality. They sort of gather together and they take votes. How do they vote? They hum to figure out what to do on a given question. I'm not making this up. They hum. Because it turns out you can't hum particularly loudly, so it's not, you can't make a strong hum, you just hum. And it's a way of figuring out if there's rough consensus on a particular plan. This is a very interesting model of developing the very things on which our technology is hinging right now, and it's one in which everybody can use it. It could have turned out differently. Novell could have been the global internet, or AOL could have been. If you wanted to send email, of course, you only send it on AOL. Everybody else is an AOL member. AOL is all there is. You could imagine that as a future, but as it turned out, it didn't work that way. TCP/IP and email protocol as we know it was developed by these engineers at the IETF. So the question I want to leave in this section is the boundary between proprietary and open. How does that shift? How does that move around? How did it come to be that the operating system was novellized? It became proprietary predominantly, whereas the actual protocols and the software that integrates one computer to another is completely open. Novell doesn't get a nickel every time we send an email. And yet, Microsoft makes a nickel every time somebody buys an operating system. And again, I don't particularly begrudge them that nickel. But all of this is to say that part of the point would be to take open protocols, embrace them, and then extend them, improve them. And the improvements you make to them as a proprietary company are, of course, under the intellectual property law, yours. You own them. And then if you can get people to adopt those embraced and extended protocols, you now have, I guess the word for it would be, proprietized what was once open. Now, again, to me, it's a market. Try to proprietize what you can. The market will make decisions. Do they like what was proprietized better than what was open, even taking into account the possible lock-in that comes from going with a proprietary solution? Sure, give it a shot. But again, you want to ask, is there any way in which you as the proprietizer have an advantage thanks to an existing monopoly that may tilt the playing field in your favor, apart from what other innovations and enhancements you might make? Okay, so a second remedy. It was only mentioned at the very beginning, and so I will only talk about it very briefly, and that is criminal penalties. Could this be criminal antitrust? My answer here is yuck. That's terrible. It just seems important to me to understand there's nothing personal here. I think the campaign of demonization that goes back and forth, but at least anecdotally seems mostly focused on Microsoft and Bill Gates, is not at all helpful to the resolution of this problem. And to see it as Bill Gates is evil, he's Darth Vader, he's out to do X, Y, and Z, I think really is a misunderstanding of what the rational capitalist is about. And again, more power to him. I mean, his job is to push the envelope as far as he possibly can in order to compete. And of course, it's the job of the judicial system to say where the boundaries of the envelope are and to enforce it in some way. But to make it criminal penalties, to make it malum in se, and it's hard to imagine it malum prohibitum, right? It's like a parking ticket, a criminal violation, but nothing personal. It's hard to see that. If you're talking about sending somebody to jail, it's because you really think they have done something morally wrong. And I don't see that as a fruitful path for this litigation. Okay, third possible remedy, a fine. Charge them a one-time fee of a lot of money for what they've done. I suppose there's some amount you could fill in on the check that would actually make them feel that it wasn't worth it. I'm not sure I could guess what it is. I mean, it's funny, Bob was talking about, $70 million to run this lawsuit. And $70 million, that's like 10 seconds worth of, time racked up doing a legitimate business. So I don't know what the fine would be. And in fact, structurally, a fine seems a bad idea because it asks you to ascertain the present value of what I'm saying are things you've done that are front-loading the future. Let's say Microsoft has now secured, thanks to some of these practices, but not entirely due to them, some advantage in ownership of the future operating system. How do you possibly put a price tag on that? Particularly because you can't predict what's going to happen. You don't know whether that advantage is going to be a long-term one, even if it is, if you decide that it's an unfair one. And for that reason, you just can't place a value on being in the driver's seat when you haven't taken the car anywhere yet, even though you can say you got to the driver's seat in a way that, again, as a matter of competition law, we don't choose to approve of and that we wish to somehow offer a remedy for. So again, I don't find a fine particularly interesting. Next, we've been hearing about divestiture and breakup. And here I must say I'm completely in agreement with Bob. A horizontal split, the idea that you separate the operating system from the applications. Okay, you're only allowed to keep doing operating system, but the idea of tying applications to it, where you have some untold advantage because maybe you get a peek at the application's interfaces sooner, which, by the way, has not been proven or entered into the record. But if you think there's some way in which there's a bad synergy, as soon as you try to excise it, what's to stop it from growing back again? Do we take out solitaire from the operating system? Do the three solitaire maintainers have to check their hats, leave Microsoft, go into Solitaire Inc., and hope that their relationship with the new Microsoft is one that keeps solitaire at the forefront of gaming in offices across America? That does seem like a highly regulatory solution that would require a permanent special master or the FTC or somebody to keep saying, that's not an operating system. I've heard a wonderful talk from some people at MIT, and Farber has been brought up as well, a computer scientist at UPenn. There are purists who will happily tell you about what's in an operating system and what isn't. That may be nice and good for a computer science department, but it does seem indeed to be quite an abandonment of the idea of let the market decide whether an operating system is sufficiently ponderous because it's throwing in so many whistles and bells that it's not of value anymore, rather than a particular professor saying so. The other idea was a vertical split. The idea that you should go ahead, make 5 virgin copies of the Windows 98 source code, split Microsoft by random lottery or some other fashion, vertically create Microsoft, Microsoft Prime, Microsoft Double Prime, Microsoft Triple Prime, etc., put them in new headquarters, and let them compete with each other. That seems, again, like not a particularly good remedy. As somebody brought up already, who gets bill? Whoever gets bill is the person that, or the company that is already advantaged against the other primes. And also, eventually, you can imagine a war. There's a winner. Everybody uses Prime 3 because they came up with the best odds, and guess what? You're exactly back where you started. in which case you might say, great, it's time for another lawsuit. But again, you want something that's more enduring than that kind of solution. Okay, solution number 5, compulsory licensing. I agree there are some problems with this as well. The problems are, as again has been pointed out, well, on what terms would it be? And do you have to include the documentation with it? I mean, congratulations, here's a pile of Windows 98 source code, go to town. And by the time you've actually figured out what variable A double prime is, oh, I see, that's the browser variable. By that time, of course, Windows 2000 is out, and your new version of Windows 98, made by people who didn't write the original, is just a memory in people's minds. So I agree that that's a problem. And of course, you'd also have to say, well, do you also release the source code of the applications? Of course, it might ask Microsoft to make a tough decision about integration anymore. IE isn't integrated. It will give you the OS source code, but not the IE source code, because that's not integrated. I mean, you could actually see them having to do a reverse in order not to have to license everything. Certainly not Word and Excel and Flight Simulator. Is Flight Simulator part of the operating system? But again, there are some problems with that. But now, let me jump to the punchline of all this, which I would suggest is the real remedy, and is actually grounded in some of the idea behind compulsory licensing. And the real remedy, as I see it, is actually not to specifically target Microsoft. And this is where I completely agree with Rick and with Bob saying, there is a real problem trying to just fashion something specific to this instant in time in this fast-moving industry, and that you feel is somehow helping competition in general rather than just the particular competitors to Microsoft. You'd also see this, by the way, on the fine. Once you collect the fine, one idea might be, don't just collect it and put it in the coffers for the Social Security Fund. Actually disperse it, give it to the competitors. Give Red Hat Linux, I don't know, whatever number you filled in on that check, and now you've got competition. But again, how do you favor competition generally rather than one competitor? Okay, so the answer. The answer lies in the fallacy that I think is latent in what Bob was telling us. And what Bob was telling us is the following. It started out actually with Rick. Rick said, remember, courts are the government. And if the courts end up deciding something, why, that's the government interfering in markets. Government interfering in markets, why, that's communist. Now, he didn't say it was communist, but the idea is that if you have the government getting involved, you come along with all the baggage, all the cost of imagining an industrial policy run by a federal judge interfering in functioning markets. And again, Bob says, this is private property. How dare you nationalize it? Nobody has a right to Windows source code but Windows. This is where I say, but wait. This is private property because the government says so. This is not the same as a microphone or a telephone or a brick that you might own. This is intellectual property. Intellectual property is something that is wholly a creation of the government. It comes about because the Constitution says that to promote the progress of the useful arts and the sciences, Congress may, for a limited time, establish to authors and inventors exclusive monopolies, in essence, exclusive rights to their writings and inventions, respectively. Now, the essence of intellectual property is not that you get to hold on to it and others can't take it out of your hand. It's that people can't copy it. Now, imagine what that means. It means if I say my speech is copyrighted, which I could, you can't leave this room and give it all over again. Not that you'd want to, but if you did, I would say, that's my property you just stole. And of course, I can still give my speech again. The idea just is, I'm allowed to restrain your speech, to prevent you from speaking, because the government has seen fit to promote the progress of the useful arts and the sciences to give me an exclusive right, yes, a monopoly, in my speech for a limited time. Now, if that's the way to understand it, you realize then that the actual monopoly behind the monopoly, if such there is an intellectual property monopoly. It's the government that gave. So for one thing, when you say, how dare the government take it away, realize that the thing it's taking away is what it gave through the intellectual property law. But then to me it suggests, well, wait a minute. Instead of giving it and then having all these problems with the different remedies trying to take it away properly and just from this one person that made too much hay out of intellectual property, what if you looked at the nature of the giving and tried to change that? Right now, thanks to the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, which it's already funny. It was actually introduced by Mary Bono, Congresswoman Mary Bono, who said, if Sonny were here today and if he had his way, copyright would be forever. But my lawyers advised me there's a problem with that, so I'm only going for 20 more years. And what that meant after being signed was that 95 years, 95 years is the limited time that you have that exclusive right in your work, copyrighted work, before it reverts to the public domain. Now, after that 95 years, the bargain is government will defend with guard dogs and submachine guns your right to prevent other people from uttering the things you uttered for 95 years, after which it's all theirs, and no longer will the government help you defend this exclusive monopoly. Now, that may make sense for such enduring favorites as The Lion King or for a Madonna song, but I want to suggest that the underlying premise of all of this, that computer software is creative expression subject to 95 years of protection, monopoly protection given freely by the government until it lapses to the public domain, at which point the public is free to use it for whatever purposes it wants, is misguided. 95 years from now, it's unclear that Windows 95, by then of course I guess it would be Windows 2095, would be a great year. All right, everybody, finally the locks are off, we can get to Windows 95. And of course 5 years before, we got to DOS, and 5 years before that, the TRS-80, it's wide open. It really is nonsensical. So what if, just play what if with me for a second. What if, for computer software, we say it's sufficiently different expression from The Lion King or for writings and blah, blah, blah. We're going to say for computer expression, for programs, you get 5 years. I don't know, maybe 10. Well, we have to figure this out. What's the right balance? We want to give you enough years of exclusive monopoly so that it's worth it to you to make it, and you can milk it for all it's worth for that 5 years and recoup your money. But after that, it's free. Anybody can take it, anybody can copy it, the source code is free, they can do as they wish with it. Now that's a very interesting thought, because first what it means is it applies equally to everybody. It's not singling out Microsoft and saying, blah, 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 you're bad, we're going to make you license your stuff. It's saying the deal for everybody is you get 5 years. And typically if you talk to a venture capitalist about your great plan or for a new application that's going to revitalize software and make everybody $1 billion, they don't want to hear about a plan that's going to work 10 years from now. After 5 years, your chart need not project anything further because, again, the underlying premise of this, you have no idea what's going to happen 5 years from now. You'd better have a plan for recouping your money within the next 5 years or it's all over. Would it actually injure Microsoft? Will they regret the decision for having made DOS if DOS were suddenly in the public domain today? Would they regret it on Windows 3.1 if Windows 3.1 were suddenly in the public domain today? The only way I suggest they might regret it, really, is not loss of sales of Windows 3.1, although arguably other countries are getting brought up only slowly to the standards. And so fine, we'll do it differently for other countries. But their real regret is, wait a minute, if Windows 3.1 source code becomes free, goes from the proprietary to the open, those balding engineers at the IETF that I was talking about can come and start picking over it, can start making things out of it. They can make Windows 3.2, which oddly competes pretty well with Windows 2000. Now we've actually got a problem. What's the problem? We've got competition. And I want to suggest then that actually drastically shortening the term of copyright, coming up with a scheme, maybe you don't even call it copyright, for the protection of computer software, such that you get your just desserts defined by the Constitution as that which is enough to promote the progress of the arts and sciences, to give you the right incentive to create it to begin with, but no more, so that after you've done so, all of these allegations of you can leverage that monopoly, thanks to the network effects I'm talking about, into other things, evaporate. Because naturally, at the end of the 5 years, it enters into the public domain. So that's at least my idea, meant to be as incendiary as possible about the real remedy in this case. And with that, I guess we turn to the panel discussion.